I stood frozen, the invitation still in my hand, my fingers trembling as the harsh words of my son echoed in my mind. The greatest gift for our wedding is if you disappear from our family. It was as if the years I spent raising him, loving him, meant nothing. After everything, after the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the unconditional love, I was now the one who had to vanish. He didn't even say goodbye, just that cruel sentence, leaving me stranded in a family I thought I belonged to. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The cafe was a hushed retreat from the bustle of the city, a place where whispered conversations and clinking coffee cups danced around the smooth hum of a jazz piano. Diana had chosen it deliberately, an upscale setting with dim lights and polished wood floors, perfect for the family meeting that had been arranged under the guise of a simple conversation. As she entered, the door chimed softly, and her eyes quickly found Ethan and Vanessa at a corner table by the window. Ethan's back was straight, his jaw clenched. The all-too-familiar coldness in his posture unmistakable even from a distance. Vanessa, on the other hand, was poised, her smile a little too bright as she sipped from a champagne flute that caught the light just right, making her seem even more untouchable than she already was. Diana walked toward them with measured steps, her heels clicking against the floor like the ticking of an unseen clock. She felt the weight of every gaze that followed her, an invisible audience watching, sensing the tension thickening in the air. She resisted the urge to glance at the door, knowing that her exit was still a few moments away. "Mom," Ethan said, his voice colder than the air outside. He didn't rise to greet her, didn't offer a smile. Just that look, sharply dismissive, as though his presence here was already an act of mercy. "Vanessa and I thought it'd be best to clear the air before the wedding." Diana smiled politely, nodding as she took a seat across from them. She already knew the purpose of this meeting. They wanted something from her. They always did. And despite the years of manipulation, despite everything, she still hadn't learned to fully shield herself from their calculated blows. Vanessa put down her glass, eyes twinkling with an arrogance that Diana had come to loathe. "We need to talk about the family legacy," she said, the words dripping with a thinly veiled venom. "Or rather, about the part you still think you play in it." Diana's eyes flicked to Ethan's, catching the way his expression had hardened further, the glint of impatience curling the edges of his lips. He shifted, barely able to meet her gaze for more than a second, as though the woman who had given him life was beneath him in every conceivable way. Then, just as Diana was about to respond, Ethan leaned forward, his cold eyes locking onto hers. "The greatest gift," he said, his voice like ice scraping against stone, "is if you disappear from our family." The words struck Diana like a slap to the face, each syllable a brutal reminder of the child she had raised, of the son who, over the years, had twisted their bond into something unrecognizable. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a fleeting moment the entire cafe seemed to hold its breath with her. But then, just as quickly, she gathered herself, the mother she had always been, the woman who had buried griefs deeper than most could understand. Vanessa let out a small, cruel laugh, her champagne flute raised in a mocking toast. "A mother should know when to let go, don't you think?" she purred, her voice too sweet, a perfect mask over the bitterness. Diana's heart cracked, a jagged break she couldn't ignore. She saw the hunger in Vanessa's eyes, the thirst for control. She saw the distance in Ethan's, a gulf that had only grown wider as the years wore on. She saw how easily they had come to see her not as the foundation of their family, but as an obstacle, something to be discarded. But Diana was no longer the woman she had once been. She had learned how to navigate such cruelty, how to accept it with grace. So, she remained silent for a moment, letting the sting of their words linger before she spoke. "I will never disappear," she said quietly, her voice soft but firm. The words felt more like a promise to herself than a declaration to them. "But I will leave you with your day." There was no dramatics, no grand exit, just a quiet decision to walk away from the table, from their cruelty, and from the weight of what she could no longer change. The diners around them glanced up, sensing the charged atmosphere, but no one dared interrupt. Diana stood up slowly, her hands resting briefly on the back of the chair before she turned toward the door. For the briefest moment, Ethan's eyes flicked to her. Something, regret, flickering there, before it was smothered by his typical icy indifference. Vanessa didn't even bother to look up, her fingers brushing idly against the rim of her glass, as though Diana's departure was nothing more than a nuisance. With a final glance at the pair, Diana walked out. Her breath caught slightly in the cool air of the street, but she exhaled slowly, as if letting go of the last remnants of something she had long since lost. Dignity. That was what she had kept. Even in the face of betrayal, she could still stand tall. And yet, as she walked away, there was a gnawing sense that this was only the beginning. Diana's hands rested lightly on the wheel as she drove through the quiet streets of Chicago. The city, familiar and unchanging, seemed like a distant echo of the confrontation that had just unfolded. The weight of Ethan's words lingered, but there was something comforting about the rhythm of the road, the hum of the engine beneath her. It was in moments like this that she felt a sense of control, something that had slipped through her fingers more often than she cared to admit in the past few months. She turned the corner, and there it was, the cathedral. Its spires rose into the sky, towering above the city as though it had always been meant to stand in defiance of time. Adjacent to it, the luxury hotel gleamed, its polished windows reflecting the sky and the city's pulse. The buildings were monuments to the empire she had built. She had poured her blood, sweat, and tears into them, and though the world might forget the names behind the steel and stone, Diana Moore knew the truth. A small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corners of her lips. Her company owned both the cathedral and the hotel. The contracts were signed under her holding group, her quiet, invisible empire. No one knew it. No one needed to. As the car passed by, Diana slowed down just enough to take in the sight, letting the moment wash over her. She had been here when they were nothing more than blueprints, ideas that had seemed impossible in the early days. Now, they were monuments, silent reminders of her perseverance, her vision, and yes, her quiet strength. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. She picked it up with one hand, glancing at the screen. Harold's name appeared. The old lawyer had never been one for unnecessary words, and yet she had always trusted him to keep things in order. "Everything's in place," Harold's voice crackled through the speaker, steady as ever. "Contracts for the venue go through your holding group, just as we discussed. The cathedral, the hotel. It's all on paper. No one will question it." Diana's fingers tightened slightly around the wheel. She didn't need to hear the words again. She already knew what Harold was saying. The power, the control. It was all hers. Even if the rest of the world didn't realize it. Even if her son and his fiancée still thought they could claim what was rightfully hers. She ended the call without a word, her gaze flicking back to the buildings ahead. For the first time in years, a sense of calm settled in her chest. They thought they owned the venue, thought they controlled the narrative. But Diana would show them the truth, in the quietest of ways. Later that afternoon, Diana sat in her office. The city sprawled out below her. It was a penthouse overlooking the lake, the kind of place most people only dreamed of. She had earned every inch of it. The soft whir of the air conditioning filled the space as she reviewed the final documents that Harold had sent over. Authorizations for the luxury hotel's exclusive catering contract, the cathedral's lighting, the security details. Her fingers danced over the papers, signing off on each one with a calm precision that bordered on mechanical. She had been signing papers like this for decades, yet each time it felt like a new chapter, a new step in her ongoing battle for control. The truth was simple. Her son had underestimated her. Vanessa had too. They could prance around in their world of perfection, but Diana knew where the real power lay. Her phone buzzed again, this time a message from Martha. Vanessa's gushing online about her perfect wedding venue. Ethan's telling everyone about the expense, sparing no detail. Diana smirked. Of course they were. The show had already begun, and they had no idea they were playing in a theater where they weren't the stars. She set the phone down and leaned back in her chair, watching the ripples on the surface of Lake Michigan. The wedding was mere days away. Diana could almost feel the delicate threads of fate pulling tighter around the people who thought they held the strings. Vanessa's words, her calculated smile, came back to her. A mother should know when to let go. Diana shook her head slightly, the smile gone now, replaced by something sharper, colder. She wasn't going anywhere, not this time. The wedding would be their day, but the stage belonged to her. And as the last authorization was signed, the pen resting heavily on the desk, Diana's phone buzzed again. Another message from Martha. Ethan's on his way to the venue with Vanessa. They're planning something big. Be ready. Diana's heart raced, but only for a moment. She straightened in her chair, exhaling slowly, the calm returning as if it had never left. Let them think they control everything, she thought. They're about to find out they never did. And as she stared out at the lake, the future seemed clearer than ever. Diana's car rumbled over the familiar streets as she made her way toward the diner. It was a place she and Martha had frequented for years, a quiet, unassuming spot that seemed untouched by time. The booths were lined with dark vinyl, the air heavy with the scent of brewed coffee and sizzling bacon. It was here that Diana had come to gather her thoughts when things felt too heavy to carry alone. And today, the weight was greater than ever. The bell above the door jingled softly as Diana entered, the warmth of the diner wrapping around her like a blanket. She spotted Martha immediately, sitting in their usual booth at the back, a cup of black coffee in front of her. Martha's wry smile was already in place, her sharp eyes taking in Diana's every move. Sit down, kid, Martha said, her tone as dry as ever. You look like you've got the world on your shoulders, but I know you'll put it all in its place. Diana slid into the booth across from her friend, the weight of the morning's events still lingering. But here, in this space, she could let it go, just for a moment. I've been thinking, Diana began, her voice low and steady, about how to reclaim what's mine. This wedding, it's supposed to be theirs, but I've spent years building this empire, Martha. I won't just step aside. Martha took a sip of her coffee, nodding slowly. You never were one to step aside. So, what's your move? Diana leaned in, her eyes sharpening. Let them have their day. Let them think they're in control. Let them enjoy the illusion of owning everything. But when it's time for the spotlight, they'll find out it's my stage. Martha's lips twitched into a smile, impressed. Cold as ice, that's what you are. Colder than Lake Michigan in the winter. Diana didn't flinch. She had grown accustomed to this side of herself, the side that had learned how to survive betrayal, how to take control without being noticed. The side that had, for too long, been forced into the background. But no longer. Not this time. Harold's been helping, Diana continued, her voice quieter now as she pulled out a folded document from her bag and slid it across the table. I had him go through the contracts again, just to be sure, Everything's in my name. My holding group controls the cathedral, the hotel, the catering contracts. Even the staff have been briefed to follow my instructions, should things go sideways. Martha's eyebrows rose and she took a moment to scan the papers. You've got everything locked down, don't you? Those two have no idea what's coming. Diana nodded, but her eyes were distant now, focused on something beyond the booth. Beyond the city that stretched out beyond the diner's windows. Vanessa's been too confident, posting on social media, flaunting the diamond ring like it's some sort of prize. She has no idea that her perfect wedding is nothing more than a setup for a lesson she'll never forget. The thought of Vanessa, smug and self-assured, made Diana's chest tighten. The woman had underestimated her. That much was clear. But Diana had never played by the rules of the game that others set. And this time, it would be her turn to rewrite the script. Vanessa's always been good at looking the part, Diana muttered, eyes narrowing as she spoke. But all she's done is create a spectacle. She's too busy showing off on Instagram, sharing every single detail, every moment, as if the world should bow to her. Martha chuckled, sipping her coffee. It's all about the show with her, isn't it? Doesn't matter if it's real, as long as it looks real. Diana's lips curved into a faint smile. Exactly. And when the curtain falls, they'll find themselves standing on a stage they don't own. The waitress came by with a refill of coffee, but neither woman acknowledged her. Diana's mind was already turning, planning the next moves, feeling the pieces of the puzzle slotting into place. Everything was set. Ethan and Vanessa had no idea how much control she had over every aspect of this wedding, how much power she had kept hidden, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Diana leaned back in the booth, glancing out the window at the steady stream of traffic passing by, each car filled with people lost in their own worlds. In a way, she envied them. The simplicity of their lives, their ignorance of the game being played around them. But that wasn't her world. She had chosen this path, and now she would see it through. Martha seemed to read her thoughts. You're playing the long game, huh? Diana nodded, the weight of her resolve settling deep within her. Yes, and they'll never hear the end of it. As the door to the diner swung open and another customer entered, the faintest flicker of doubt crossed Diana's mind. She silenced it quickly. There was no room for doubt now. She had a plan, and she was in control. And the moment was coming, soon, when Ethan and Vanessa would find out the hard way that the game they thought they were winning was one they would lose. The city stretched out below Diana's condo like an unspoken promise, its lights flickering in rhythmic patterns that felt both distant and close, a constant hum of motion that seemed to mirror the churn in her chest. She stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, hands pressed against the cool glass, her eyes tracing the skyline. The events of the past few days felt like ripples on the surface of something much bigger, something she could control. The doorbell rang, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Harold. He had always been punctual, and today he was carrying something more than just documents. He was carrying the final pieces of a puzzle that, once completed, would give her the leverage she needed. Diana opened the door, and Harold, his glasses perched low on his nose, walked in without a word. He was the kind of man who spoke little but said everything with his presence. In his hand, he held a thick folder, the edges worn from handling. He handed it to her without fanfare. Everything's in order, he said simply. Diana took the folder and motioned for him to sit, as she sank into the deep leather chair behind her desk. She didn't need to look at the paperwork immediately. She knew what it contained. The clauses that had been buried within the contracts. The terms no one but Harold had thought to investigate. She opened the folder slowly, flipping through the pages with practiced ease. The legal jargon blurred into the background, but her eyes snapped to one key section, Vanessa's signature, bold and careless at the bottom of the page. Diana's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. There it is, Diana murmured. Harold watched her with a quiet satisfaction, but there was something else in his eyes, a spark of admiration for her sharpness. She overlooked it. That clause gives you the final say on any dispute involving the property. If she tries to pull anything, it's yours. The cathedral, the hotel, the staff, all of it. Diana nodded, the gravity of the moment sinking in. Ethan and Vanessa had no idea what they had walked into. They thought they were in control. But Diana had been playing her own game, one they hadn't even known they were part of. She set the papers down and leaned back in her chair, eyes flicking to the city outside. They never read the fine print. Vanessa was too busy dreaming of her social media posts to notice. Harold raised an eyebrow, his voice a little less neutral than before. They don't seem to know you very well. They never did, Diana said, her voice quieter now, but resolute. They never bothered to ask how much I really had left. How much I had been quietly taking back. Martha's voice interrupted her thoughts, the familiar sound cutting through the stillness of the room as she appeared in the doorway, holding a bottle of bourbon in one hand and 2 glasses in the other. To their downfall, she said, her grin wide and knowing as she poured a generous amount into both glasses. She slid one across the table to Diana, who took it without hesitation. To their downfall, Diana echoed, raising her glass. The amber liquid swirled in the glass, catching the light from the windows, and for a brief moment Diana allowed herself a small sigh of relief. The pieces were falling into place. The wedding, the show, the spectacle, everything was set in motion. But the best part was yet to come. As she took a slow sip, her phone buzzed sharply, cutting through the quiet moment. She set the glass down and glanced at the screen. The email was from Ethan. Stay away from the wedding. Diana's lips curled into a tight smile as she stared at the message, the words almost comical in their coldness. She could feel the anger in his words, the tension wrapped around the email like a thread waiting to snap. Without a word, she deleted the email, her fingers moving quickly over the screen. The action was simple, final, like a door quietly closing. There was no need for a response, no need to dignify his request with a word. She didn't have to go to the wedding. She didn't need their permission. The thought of it lingered for a moment. Diana had spent so many years building this empire, navigating their petty games, their expectations. And now, they would have to learn just how little power they truly held. Let them think they control everything, Diana said, her voice steady as she met Martha's eyes across the table. It won't be the wedding they expect. Martha raised her glass again, a wicked smile tugging at her lips. You always did know how to steal the show? Diana's gaze drifted back to the city outside the windows, her thoughts sharpening like the edge of a blade. This was her moment. She wasn't going to wait for it to come to her. She was going to make it happen. And when the curtain finally rose, she would be the one standing in the spotlight. Everything else was just the prelude. The first light of dawn stretched across the city like a slow-moving tide, casting a golden sheen on the tall buildings that lined Lake Michigan. The bells of St. Michael's Cathedral began to ring, their deep, resonant sound rolling through the air, filling the space between the city's high-rise towers. It was the perfect day for a wedding, or so Ethan and Vanessa had planned. Every detail had been carefully orchestrated, every moment timed to perfection. But Diana knew better. She stood in front of her vanity, the soft hum of her apartment filling the air as she adjusted the deep navy gown she had chosen for the occasion. The fabric clung to her form, both elegant and commanding, the color a stark contrast to the pale white silk that Vanessa would wear in mere hours. Diana's fingers lingered for a moment over the delicate diamond necklace, a subtle reminder of the strength that had been passed down through her family. She wasn't going to disappear. Not today. A quick glance at the clock told her it was time. She had no need to rush. This day would unfold on her terms. With a single, deliberate movement, she picked up her purse, gave herself one last look in the mirror, and stepped out into the car waiting for her outside. At the cathedral, the atmosphere was electric. A white carpet had been laid down the aisle, lined with lavish floral arrangements that reflected the bright sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. Guests in tuxedos and gowns mingled, their voices a soft murmur of excitement and gossip. Every surface sparkled, every detail perfect in its execution. But despite the apparent joy in the air, there was an undercurrent of tension, a whisper that passed from guest to guest. "Where's the mother of the groom?" someone asked, their voice hushed, as if it were a forbidden question. "She must be busy, I guess." Another answered with a shrug, their voice full of uncertainty. The murmurs continued as the bridal party took their places. Vanessa, radiant in her flowing white gown, glided gracefully down the aisle, her eyes wide and proud. She smiled at the guests, at the photographers, at the world. This was her moment, her day, her image, her wedding, her victory. Ethan stood at the altar, his jaw clenched tight, his smile barely disguising the tension in his posture. His gaze never quite reached his mother, though his eyes searched the crowd for her. It was as if he feared her presence might undo everything he had worked so hard to control. The photographers snapped endless pictures, capturing each carefully curated moment as Ethan beamed for the cameras. The vows would come next, his promises to Vanessa, the future he had already claimed for himself. It was all happening just as he had imagined. And yet, a knot of discomfort twisted in his gut. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Diana arrived at the cathedral quietly, the soft sound of her heels against the marble floors a stark contrast to the bustling energy of the event. She had come alone, her entrance understated, but it was purposeful. She moved with a quiet grace, not seeking attention, but not hiding either. Heads turned in small surprise, but no one dared to acknowledge her presence. No one except the staff. As Diana made her way past the rows of seats, she couldn't help but feel the weight of every gaze that followed her, though none dared to speak. She was the one person missing from the picture they had carefully crafted, the uninvited guest who had made her entrance when no one expected her. The whispers, though soft, still buzzed in the air. But as Diana approached the front of the cathedral, something strange happened. One of the staff members, who had been anticipating this moment for days, came forward, his face a mask of professionalism. "This way, Mrs. Moore," he said, his voice firm yet respectful, guiding her toward the front row. Diana's eyes flicked toward the front of the church. Ethan and Vanessa's seats were already filled with guests, but the staff had prepared something else for her. A seat, front and center, as if it were always meant to be hers. There, in the cathedral's front pew, Diana was seated. The realization hit her in a slow, almost surreal wave. She wasn't just a spectator. She wasn't even an uninvited guest. She had been given a place of honor by the staff's orders. They knew who she was. They knew the truth. And in that quiet moment, Diana realized she had already won. Ethan's heart raced when he saw her, sitting at the front, the navy gown a stark contrast to the bright whites of Vanessa's dress and the sea of formal black suits. His eyes locked onto her as if searching for the words to say, but none came. His mouth went dry, his smile faltering as the shock settled in. Vanessa, too, caught sight of Diana, her face twitching with a fleeting moment of disbelief before it was replaced with something darker. Resentment, perhaps, or just the knowledge that something had shifted, something out of her control. Diana sat still, her gaze steady, her hands folded gracefully in her lap. She looked out over the sea of guests, the quiet confidence in her posture a sharp contrast to the frantic, silent chaos that Ethan was trying so desperately to hold together. She wasn't just witnessing this wedding, she was watching a spectacle that was never truly theirs to own. The photographer clicked away, capturing images of a mother seated where she had never been invited, her presence a quiet rebellion against the day that was supposed to belong to Ethan and Vanessa. As the ceremony began, the whispers started again, this time louder, filled with awe and uncertainty. Everyone knew something was happening, something was changing. And for the first time in years, the wedding wasn't about Ethan and Vanessa. It was about Diana, and no one could stop it now. The first chords of the organ echoed through the cathedral, rising up like a tide that could not be resisted. The guests turned, their eyes trained on the grand aisle as Vanessa made her way toward the altar, her white silk gown trailing behind her in waves, a perfect vision of a bride in her moment of triumph. Ethan stood at the altar, rigid, a broad grin plastered on his face. His eyes were locked onto Vanessa, but a flicker of unease passed over his features. Something was wrong, but he couldn't place it. It was just a feeling, buried deep under the weight of all the perfection he had built around this day. Then the first murmur slipped through the crowd. Diana sat at the front, an uninvited guest with a commanding presence. Her navy gown, elegant, understated, drew the eye like a sharp contrast to the sea of white and black. The low hum of the whispers rose, reaching Ethan's ears like a soft but persistent wave. "Who let her sit there?" Vanessa hissed under her breath, her smile faltering as she glared toward the front pew. The gasp she had stifled earlier now bubbled over in her eyes. She was a woman used to being in control, and Diana's presence at the front of the cathedral shattered her illusion of dominance in an instant. She clenched her hands into fists, her knuckles going white. Ethan's face flushed a deep shade of red as his eyes darted toward his mother, then back to the crowd. The soft, polite murmurs were growing louder now. He couldn't breathe. This wasn't supposed to happen. Diana wasn't supposed to be here. This was supposed to be his day. His heart hammered in his chest as his fingers curled into the palms of his hands, but no words came. His mouth felt dry. His mother had done this to him. The seat she occupied, at the front, the very seat that should have been saved for the bride's family, was a statement, a defiant one. He turned to Vanessa, his lips trembling with frustration. I don't know. I'll... But before he could finish, his words broke off, swallowed by the swell of music. The priest, oblivious to the tension pulsing through the room, began the ceremony as though nothing was amiss. The soft hum of the organ, once reserved for the bride's entrance, now served as a backdrop to Ethan's panic. Diana, however, remained still, serene in the face of his fury. She had long learned the art of restraint, of letting others flounder in their desperation while she held her composure. She sat with her hands folded elegantly in her lap, her expression unreadable, as if nothing in the world could disturb the peace she had cultivated in this moment. Her eyes were fixed forward, her gaze sharp but not cold, calm but purposeful, as if she were savoring the unfolding chaos just out of sight. Around her, the guests shifted uncomfortably. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. "That's his mother," one of them murmured, her voice filled with disbelief. She's at the front?" Another voice joined in, lower, hushed. "That's not how it's supposed to be." But Diana remained untouched by the words swirling around her. She hadn't come for their approval. She had come to take her place, quietly, assertively, without the need for any declaration. Her seat was no accident. She had been given it by the staff, but that was nothing more than a reflection of the unspoken truth. She had always held the real power in this room. Ethan, on the other hand, was unraveling. His eyes kept flicking toward her, but each glance only made the tension in his chest tighten. The images of the day he had crafted for Vanessa, perfect, pristine, the illusion of control, had been ripped apart in a single, decisive moment. He couldn't move her. She was already seated, the world around her falling into place in ways he hadn't anticipated. Vanessa's icy gaze locked onto Diana, her mouth twisting with frustration. But there was a flicker of something darker behind her eyes, a realization that Diana had not only outmaneuvered her, but had done so with the kind of quiet grace Vanessa would never possess. She clenched her teeth, trying to hold back the anger that was threatening to surface. The priest's voice rang out, steady and unwavering as he continued the ceremony, oblivious to the conflict playing out in the front pew. His words flowed with the cadence of ritual, but for everyone in the room, the real drama wasn't unfolding at the altar. It was unfolding at the back of the church, where Diana sat like a statue of defiance, her every breath a silent testament to the control she had taken back. Ethan swallowed hard, his eyes darting between the ceremony and his mother, unable to reconcile the two realities. He had spent so long preparing for this moment, imagining the perfect day. And now, here she was, seated like the queen she had always been, unshaken by the storm he had created. Diana's eyes never left the priest. She sat, calm, composed, unbothered. The storm would pass, and she would remain, standing tall when it was all over. Vanessa, on the other hand, could feel the heat rising in her chest. She wasn't going to let this stand, but as the ceremony continued, she found herself trapped, her power slipping away with every passing second. The whispers, the judgment. It was all a reminder of just how little control she truly had. The seat Diana had been given wasn't just a place in the church. It was a declaration, one that could never be undone. The cathedral was a blur of gold and stained glass, light filtering through the tall windows in fractured streams of color that scattered across the polished floor. The air was thick with incense and anticipation, the faint hum of whispered conversations still lingering as the priest continued his steady cadence. Time seemed to stretch as Vanessa and Ethan stood before him, hands clasped, their eyes fixed on each other with that all-too-familiar look of expectation. It was a moment they'd rehearsed for months, a moment they believed would mark the beginning of their perfect life. But the moment was far from perfect. The tension in the room was palpable. And it wasn't just the formalities that felt stiff. It was the air between Ethan and Diana, invisible but heavy. Diana sat still at the front, a sharp contrast to the spectacle unfolding at the altar. Her presence, so deliberate, so quiet, commanded the space while Ethan seemed to shrink under its weight. He couldn't look at her. His gaze was locked on Vanessa, but it was as if a part of him was already retreating into himself, unable to confront the world he had built, a world that was now unraveling in front of him. Vanessa caught sight of Diana again, her gaze darting toward the front pew. Her eyes narrowed, and her lips tightened in a barely contained sneer. Every movement, every shift in Diana's posture felt like an accusation to her. She was the bride, the center of this day, yet Diana's unspoken defiance was casting a long shadow over everything. The icy glare that Vanessa threw at Diana was venomous, but Diana didn't flinch. She didn't move. She didn't react. The priest's voice rose, asking the age-old question, the one that had been asked 1,000 times before, but with a fresh edge. "Do you, Ethan Moore, take Vanessa King to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Ethan's lips parted for a moment, but his heart wasn't in the answer. He glanced sideways, his eyes shifting briefly to his mother, but only for a second. He couldn't face her, not here, not now, and certainly not in front of everyone. "I do," he said, the words forced, each syllable hollow, empty of the conviction he had once hoped for. The priest turned to Vanessa, his voice steady. And do you, Vanessa King, take Ethan Moore to be your lawfully wedded husband? Vanessa's smile was a perfect mask, a serene expression that barely concealed the storm raging inside. She locked eyes with Ethan, her fingers squeezing his with practiced sweetness. I do, she said, her voice crisp, her tone full of unyielding certainty. The air in the room shifted as the vows began. Vanessa's words were beautiful, carefully constructed, a vision of a future she thought she could control. She spoke of love, of partnership, of forever. She made promises she would never keep, but they were enough to fill the space, to give the illusion that this was the union she had worked so hard for. But even as her voice rang out, a sense of emptiness clung to the air. Ethan's vows came next, and though he spoke with the same rehearsed sincerity, his mind was elsewhere. He avoided looking at his mother, his eyes fixed on Vanessa, but even then, his words felt like an echo. The promises he made seemed to hang in the air between them, fragile and distant. Diana remained still, her hands resting neatly in her lap, her expression unreadable. Her eyes never wavered, her posture unshaken by the pretense of this grand performance. The vows, the words they spoke, meant little to her. She wasn't here for the ceremony. She wasn't here for them. She was here for herself, to reclaim what had always been hers, to remind them that the power had never truly left her grasp. The priest's voice rose again, signaling the end of the vows. I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride. A ripple of excitement passed through the guests, a collective sigh of relief that the most anticipated moment of the day had arrived. Ethan leaned in to kiss Vanessa, but for a moment, he hesitated. The weight of the day, the weight of his choices, hung heavy on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong, something he couldn't control. But as he kissed Vanessa, the applause erupted around them, filling the space with an empty cheer. The guests clapped, their hands coming together in unison as the newlyweds turned to face them. Ethan's forced smile never reached his eyes. He clutched Vanessa's hand. But his heart wasn't in it. The noise, the celebration, it all felt distant, as though he were watching it from afar. Diana, however, remained motionless. The applause, the cheers, the excitement, it all passed her by. She was beyond it now. Beyond them. From across the room, Martha's gaze met Diana's, a silent exchange between old friends. Martha squeezed Diana's hand, her face a mirror of pride and satisfaction. The moment was hers. And as the applause rang out, Diana knew it. This was just the beginning. The reception hall shimmered with opulence. Gold accents glinted under the warm lighting, reflecting off the crystal chandeliers that hung like heavy jewels above the sea of well-dressed guests. The scent of gourmet food and expensive perfume mingled in the air, wrapping around the room like a velvet cloak. The guests, elegant in their attire, moved in a slow dance of conversation and clinking glasses, their voices a hushed buzz that seemed to reverberate off the high ceilings. Vanessa stood near the center of the room, her head held high, her smile wide enough to blind anyone who dared question her. She was in her element now, surrounded by a circle of VIP guests, all laughter and admiration. She spoke loudly, her voice cutting through the soft murmur of the crowd as she gestured to the extravagant floral arrangements and the gleaming marble floors. "Isn't it just perfect?" she cooed, her eyes scanning the room as if the entire space belonged to her. "No expense spared," she added, her voice laced with the kind of sweetness that only a woman who thought she had it all could muster. Her guests nodded eagerly, their faces plastered with smiles. "It's breathtaking, Vanessa," one of them said, the praise flowing easily. But underneath the facade there was a tension that Vanessa wasn't quite able to mask. Every so often, her gaze flickered across the room, searching for something, or perhaps someone. Her eyes eventually landed on Diana, who was seated at the far end of the room, her presence quiet but unmistakable. There, among the guests who had been invited to celebrate Vanessa's moment, Diana sat with an air of detached elegance, watching, waiting. Vanessa's smile tightened, but she quickly turned her attention back to her guests. "Everything's perfect, just perfect," she repeated, almost to herself, her voice hollow despite the radiant mask she wore. Ethan stood at the edge of the room, his glass of champagne barely touched in his hand. He wasn't truly present in this moment. The clinking of glass and the laughter of his guests felt distant, a dull hum in the background. His forced smile hadn't wavered, but there was something unsettling in his eyes, a conflict he couldn't suppress, a growing sense that this day was no longer his. His mind kept returning to that single moment at the altar, to the sight of Diana sitting at the front of the church like a sovereign figure. How had this happened? How had it come to this? He cleared his throat and clinked his glass, his voice rising above the hum of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone carefully controlled but hollow. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate this day with Vanessa and me." The words felt rehearsed, mechanical. "It's a new chapter, one we're excited to begin together." A chorus of polite applause followed, but it didn't reach Ethan's ears. His words, too, felt like they belonged to someone else, a script he had memorized, but no longer cared to perform. He glanced toward Vanessa, who was beaming with the satisfaction of an actress who had just received a standing ovation. His gaze flicked briefly to Diana, who hadn't moved since she entered the room. Her eyes, calm and calculating, never left the space before her. The tension that had been building since the ceremony was thick in the air, and Ethan knew it. He could feel it in the weight of every gesture, every smile he exchanged with his guests. The attention, the focus. He was no longer the center of the room. It was Diana, who seemed to own every glance, every whispered word. Diana sat serenely, her hands folded in her lap, her glass untouched. The waitstaff, who had once been busy with the usual duties of a high-end event, now gave her a wide berth. Their respect was palpable, their gazes deferential. They had been briefed, of course, on her status, on the quiet authority she carried, the legacy that couldn't be ignored. With every passing minute, their actions seemed to convey that Diana wasn't just another guest. She was something more. From the DJ booth, Harold caught Diana's eye. His face, as always, was composed, but there was a gleam of understanding in his eyes. He nodded subtly, giving a slight, almost imperceptible gesture with his hand. He was ready. The time had come. Diana didn't move at first. She simply allowed the moment to stretch, the silence between them building. The hum of the reception continued around her. Laughter, clinking glasses, the gentle thrum of a string quartet in the background. The moment, however, felt suspended, as if the world were holding its breath, waiting for her to make her move. Slowly, she rose from her seat. The room's focus shifted, as if the air itself parted for her. The staff watched her with quiet reverence. Guests who had previously ignored her presence now turned their heads, murmurs passing like ripples in water. Diana moved toward the center of the room, her steps measured, confident, as if she were walking into her own domain. The world around her seemed to fade into the background, her focus narrowing with each deliberate step. Vanessa noticed the shift instantly. The smile froze on her face, her eyes narrowing as Diana approached the center of the reception. The realization that Diana was about to make her presence known was a blow Vanessa hadn't been prepared for, and the effect was immediate. Ethan, too, felt it. A weight settling in his chest as he watched his mother move toward the stage, her eyes fixed forward. The spotlight, it seemed, had been stolen once again. And Diana? She had only just begun. The reception hall buzzed with the energy of celebration, the sound of glasses clinking and laughter swirling around the guests. But the space seemed to shrink in on itself as Diana made her way toward the center of the room. The quiet shift of her presence caught the attention of those closest to her, their eyes narrowing with curiosity, anticipation. Vanessa's forced smile was still in place, though the icy gleam in her eyes betrayed her discomfort. She glanced at Ethan, who stood by her side, his jaw clenched, his posture stiff and unyielding. She had always been the star of their world, the one who commanded attention, who got what she wanted. And now, here was Diana, walking toward the center of the room as if the spotlight was her birthright. As if the applause should have been for her. As Diana reached the front of the room, a hush fell over the crowd. The music faded into the background, the laughter quieted. The air grew thick with an electric tension that stretched from the front of the room to the back, where the staff gathered, standing straighter, their eyes on her. From the DJ booth, Harold's eyes locked with Diana's. He gave her the slightest nod, a gesture so small it could easily have been missed by anyone not paying attention. But Diana saw it, felt it. This was it. The moment she had been waiting for. The moment the world would see who truly held the reins of this empire. "May I have your attention, please?" Mayor Alvarez's voice boomed through the speakers, warm and familiar. He stood at the center of the room, a proud figure, flanked by a few local dignitaries. His smile was genuine, his eyes gleaming with the admiration that Diana had earned over decades of philanthropic work. The audience quieted, drawn to his presence, his stature in the community. "I would like to take a moment," the mayor continued, his voice rich with respect, "to honor a woman who has shaped not only this city, but the very foundation of our community. A woman whose commitment to philanthropy and public service has touched countless lives. I'm speaking of none other than Diana Moore." The words hung in the air like a reverent pause. The guests, already murmuring, turned toward Diana, who stood near the stage with a quiet poise. A ripple passed through the room, a collective gasp that fluttered through the crowd. Eyes widened, mouths fell open, and the celebration suddenly shifted. No one had expected this. Not today. Not in this place. Vanessa's face drained of color, her smile frozen in place as she glanced quickly at Ethan. Her hand, still clasped in his, tightened, fingers digging into his skin, though he barely noticed. Ethan's expression was taut, his jaw clenching so hard it was almost painful to watch. He stood tall, outwardly composed, but his eyes betrayed him, darting from his mother to the crowd, trying to gauge the unfolding reaction. His stomach twisted, something far more powerful than embarrassment gnawing within him. Diana, however, was still. She let the attention settle on her, accepting it with the grace that had always been hers. There was no arrogance in her stance, no rush to claim what had been hers from the start. Her expression was calm, composed, her gaze steady as she met the eyes of the guests who, for the first time, seemed to truly see her. As the mayor finished his speech, a subtle movement behind him caught the guests' eyes. Staff rolled in a large plaque, its gleaming surface catching the light as it came into view. The room stilled for a brief moment, the air thick with suspense. The plaque bore the unmistakable words, "Property of Moore Holdings." The display was unmistakable. The room buzzed again, but this time with a sense of shock and awe. No one expected to see the family name so prominently displayed. Not here. Not during a wedding that was meant to solidify Ethan's future with Vanessa. The guests' eyes darted between the plaque, the smiling mayor, and Diana, who stood like the center of a storm, untouched by the chaos swirling around her. Ethan felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This was his moment, his wedding, and yet, somehow, the attention was slipping through his fingers. Every gaze that fell upon his mother seemed to chip away at the illusion he had built. He had always believed in control, in the way things were supposed to unfold. And yet, Diana was showing him, and everyone else, that control had never truly been his. Diana's lips curled into the faintest of smiles as she turned back to face the room. The storm of reporters and guests now settled into a quieter, more respectful energy. The applause had ceased, but the air still felt charged. This was only the beginning, she knew. The day wasn't over. And neither was the war. The first move had been made. And the world, it seemed, was finally beginning to understand the true power behind the Moore name. The morning after the wedding, the world seemed quieter. The clamor of the previous day, the rush of reporters, the polite applause, and the undercurrent of tension had all faded into the background, leaving a heavy stillness in its wake. Diana sat at her desk in the high-rise office overlooking Lake Michigan, the light of early morning spilling through the windows, soft and gentle. It was a rare moment of peace in a storm she had unleashed herself. Harold entered, as punctual as ever, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. He carried a leather briefcase, which he placed on the desk in front of Diana. He didn't speak immediately, but the look in his eyes said it all. The game had changed. "I've prepared the documents," he said, breaking the silence. "Everything is in order." Diana gave a slight nod, her gaze steady on him. She had been expecting this moment, had been preparing for it, though the quiet of the room seemed to deepen everything now. The power she'd reasserted in the public eye, her control over her son's wedding day, had been satisfying, but now it was time for the real shift. She wasn't just reclaiming her dignity, she was taking back everything. Harold opened the briefcase, pulling out a series of documents. Diana didn't flinch. She'd been over them 1,000 times already. The will, which she had drafted years ago, was set to be revised in this very moment. Ethan and Vanessa, who had once expected to inherit everything, would be cut out entirely. The legacy she'd built wasn't going to be handed over to them, not when they had done nothing but try to dismantle it. "Shall we go over the details?" Harold asked, his tone respectful yet professional. He'd been part of her life for decades, ever since the earliest days of Moore Holdings, and he knew the weight of this moment. Diana's fingers lightly traced the edge of the first page. "No need," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "Everything is clear." She looked up at him. "Ethan and Vanessa are out. I'm leaving them nothing." Her eyes flickered with something close to satisfaction. "The majority of my estate will go to city charities and education funds, as discussed. To those who've earned it, not to those who expect it." Harold's lips curled into the smallest of smiles. "A fitting choice," he said, nodding slightly. "Their entitlement would have been a detriment." Diana exhaled slowly. The burden of keeping her family intact, of trying to hold on to a false hope of reconciliation, had weighed heavily on her shoulders for too long. But now, as she made this decision, she felt lighter. More at peace than she had in years. She took the pen Harold offered, signing her name at the bottom of the will with a finality that felt like freedom. Each stroke of ink was a severing of ties, not just with Ethan and Vanessa, but with a version of herself she no longer recognized, the one who had been constantly giving in, constantly forgiving. That woman was gone. In her place was someone who was ready to take control, to ensure that Moore Holdings would remain exactly as it should be. "Thank you for handling everything so efficiently, Harold," Diana said quietly, setting the pen down. "Of course," he replied, his gaze steady on her. "It's been my privilege." Diana looked over at Martha, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the room, her ever-watchful eyes focused on the proceedings. Martha had always been her anchor, a true friend through all the chaos. "Ready to sign?" Diana asked. Martha grinned, standing up from her chair and walking over to where Diana was seated. "Of course, my dear. I wouldn't miss it." She signed the document, her elegant handwriting flowing smoothly across the paper. There was no hesitation in her actions, no second thoughts. She had always stood by Diana, and now, more than ever, their alliance felt unbreakable. Diana leaned back in her chair, a small, satisfied smile forming on her lips. The weight of the moment, the decision to sever all ties with her son and his fiancée, to choose a path that felt like her own, settled into her bones, light and firm. This was no longer just a victory for her family or for more holdings. It was a victory for herself. The woman who had quietly endured and now was finally standing tall. Meanwhile, in a world far removed from this quiet moment of triumph, Vanessa was spiraling. Her phone was in her hand, her fingers furiously tapping across the screen, her eyes scanning her social media feeds. The perfect wedding day she had dreamed of had turned into something far darker, and she was determined to make sure everyone knew just how wronged she had been. Her posts were a mix of frustration and righteous indignation. "What is the point of family if they won't support you?" she ranted, tagging Ethan in every post. "Some people just can't let go, but don't worry, I'm not going anywhere." That betrayed future family drama. Her phone buzzed constantly with replies, some sympathetic, some not, but all of them feeding her rage. She tapped out another message, her words sharp, cutting through the airwaves like a knife. "Diana Moore thinks she's won. Well, she hasn't. Not by a long shot." And as she hit send, the fury in her eyes burned brighter, the echo of Diana's quiet triumph fueling her next move. Diana, on the other hand, felt only peace. Her victory was complete, and the game was far from over. The pieces were in motion, and now she could only wait for the inevitable storm to reach its full force. The city's pulse had shifted in the days following Diana's stunning move at the wedding. What had been a day of celebration for Ethan and Vanessa quickly became a public spectacle, the whispers and rumors spreading like wildfire. At first, it was subtle, just the usual whispers among the socialites and the elite. But soon, the stories grew, fueled by the ever-present media and the silent, steady pull of public curiosity. Ethan's name began appearing in headlines, but not for reasons he wanted. The whispers about his finances, his mounting debts, started to drown out the story of the wedding. His pristine, carefully curated image was cracking. The once coveted title of Son of Diana Moore was starting to feel like a burden. Business dealings that had once seemed secure were now revealed to be shaky, a house of cards about to topple. Word spread that his investments were failing, that the luxury properties he'd been managing were in deeper trouble than he'd let on. The first calls to Diana came quietly at first, calls from creditors, from business partners who had long been concerned. But it was the second wave that brought things crashing down. The financial troubles Ethan had worked so hard to hide were now impossible to conceal. The media latched onto it with fervor, painting him as nothing more than a spoiled heir who had never learned the value of hard work. His assets were frozen, his once secure empire slipping through his fingers like sand. Vanessa, ever the image of wealth and entitlement, held on desperately to her public facade. But the cracks in her world, too, began to show. Her lavish lifestyle, built on credit and illusions of grandeur, began to unravel. The endless designer dresses, the nights spent in the finest restaurants, the jet-set vacations. Each one had been an illusion, a mask she wore to cover the hollow reality beneath. As Ethan's financial situation worsened, her grip on the fantasy they had both created began to slip. She found herself scrambling, calling in favors, desperately seeking ways to maintain the life she had always known. But there was no longer a safety net. The luxurious parties that had once been her stage became suffocating, the whispered rumors turning into outright scorn. People she had once considered allies were now distancing themselves. The social media posts, once filled with pictures of her new jewelry and perfect vacations, now became an aggressive tirade. Vanessa lashed out, using her platform to paint herself as the victim of a cruel, unforgiving world. But each post, each desperate plea, only made her appear more frantic, more unstable. Ethan, on the other hand, was more measured. He had learned to suppress his emotions, to hold back the desperation that clawed at him. But as the days wore on, the pressure of his situation, coupled with the public fallout from his mother's move, became too much to bear. One evening, after the last of the press conferences, after a particularly disastrous meeting with yet another creditor, he found himself alone in his study, dialing a number he had sworn to never call again. "Mom," he said, his voice tight, "I need your help. I don't know where else to turn." Diana had been expecting this. She had known that Ethan would come to her, the way he always did when his world started to crumble. But this time, there was no sympathy in her voice. She had long since exhausted her patience for him. "You wanted me gone, Ethan," she said coldly. "I don't think you get to ask for help now." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Ethan's breath was ragged, but Diana's resolve remained unshaken. This was not her problem to solve. She had done more than enough, had fought for him for years. But she had also watched him, watched as he became someone she could no longer recognize. The boy she had raised, the man he had become, were two very different people. "I can't help you," she added softly, the words cutting through the silence like a blade. "I won't." Ethan's response was barely a whisper. I I don't know what to do." Diana's eyes flickered with something almost imperceptible. Regret? Or perhaps just finality? She had no time for sentiment now. She had made her decision. And it had already been too late for him, for both of them. At the same time, Martha poured 2 glasses of champagne in Diana's penthouse, the bubbles rising in the crystal flutes like a reminder of the world Diana had left behind. "To the future," she toasted with a wicked grin, "and to making them all realize just who's in charge." Diana smiled faintly, her fingers grazing the edge of the glass. "To the future," she echoed, her voice calm but filled with purpose. The weight of what she had done, the choices she had made, finally felt like it had fallen into place. Meanwhile, the collapse of the life Vanessa and Ethan had built continued, as though the very ground beneath them had turned to dust. The social scene, once their playground, was now their prison. The tables had turned, and everyone knew it. But the true weight of what had just shifted wasn't entirely clear yet. Diana's legacy, once uncertain, was now a force too powerful to ignore. As she walked out of her penthouse onto the balcony, her eyes fixed on the skyline, a text buzzed on her phone. She opened it without hesitation. "Vanessa's leaving me." Ethan had finally admitted it. The announcement came with the force of an avalanche. Vanessa, the woman who had so carefully crafted an image of a perfect life, took to social media in the early hours of the morning, posting a single, sharp message. It was brief, the words blunt, but it sent shockwaves through the media. "After much thought and reflection, I am filing for divorce. The decision is final." The post was accompanied by an official court filing, the documents stark in their cold legality. The world watched as the woman who had once pranced around the wedding venue in a pristine gown, basking in the approval of the crowd, now faced the wreckage of her dreams, her carefully constructed reality falling apart in a moment. Her lavish lifestyle, her empire of luxury, had crumbled to dust, and now, in her desperation, she had decided to strip it all down to the most basic and brutal of acts: divorce. The media quickly latched onto the story, picking apart every last detail. Headlines splashed across screens everywhere. "Vanessa King files for divorce," with subtext focusing on her failed marriage, her loss of status, and the rapid unraveling of everything she had worked for. Ethan, meanwhile, spiraled into an abyss. The life he had carefully curated, the illusions of power and influence, shattered all around him. His reputation, once that of a promising heir to a family dynasty, was now a husk of what it had been. His business dealings, once shrouded in secrecy, were now laid bare for the world to see. The mounting debts, the failed projects, the weak facade he had built, all of it had crumbled. Vanessa's departure only served to throw his own shortcomings into sharper relief. His phone buzzed constantly, but the calls weren't congratulatory ones. His business partners were backing out, creditors demanding their due, and his friends, if they could even be called that, were nowhere to be found. In private, away from the cameras, Ethan was a shadow of the man he had once tried so hard to be. He slurred his words at meetings, his confidence replaced by a gnawing anxiety that grew with each passing day. The weight of it all pressed on him, suffocating him as he sat in the office, eyes darting between his laptop and the steadily growing pile of paperwork. The future he had envisioned, the one where he ruled alongside Vanessa, where everything had seemed so secure, was now a distant dream. The truth was unavoidable. He had never been the one pulling the strings. It had always been Diana. Meanwhile, Diana focused on what she had always done best, building her legacy. She stepped further into the role of philanthropist and city leader, turning her attention fully toward her charity work. Her focus was unwavering, her presence at city events growing larger as the press began to hail her as Chicago's true matriarch. In the wake of Vanessa's scandalous divorce filing and Ethan's plummeting reputation, Diana was seen not only as a powerful woman, but as a stabilizing force. She had emerged from the chaos unscathed, her public persona now stronger than ever. At a charity gala, the room buzzed with admiration as Diana stood at the podium, accepting an award for her lifetime of service to the city. The applause was deafening, echoing off the walls of the grand hall. Diana, always poised, always graceful, took the moment to reaffirm her commitment to the city, to the future. The evening felt like her crowning achievement, the culmination of all the work she had quietly put in over the years. Martha, always by her side, watched with a knowing smile. "You've made them all see it, haven't you?" she whispered, her voice tinged with admiration. Diana's lips curled into a smile. "It wasn't about making them see," she replied softly. "It was always about making them understand who holds the power." Across the room, Harold stood in the shadows, his ever-watchful eyes on Diana. He had been with her from the beginning, through every negotiation, every secret contract, every moment of doubt. Now, he saw what she had become, the uncontested force of nature she had always been, and he had helped make that possible. His pride in her was silent but evident. "You've done well," he said, his voice a quiet murmur as if speaking only to himself. "Your empire's untouchable." Diana didn't look up at him, but the faintest acknowledgement passed between them, a nod, a quiet understanding. She had built something that was not only enduring but unbreakable. As the night went on, the reporters gathered in small groups, their whispers filled with praise and curiosity about Diana's newfound status. She had become the woman everyone wanted to be associated with, the woman whose name was synonymous with power and success. Ethan's name, by contrast, had become something of a cautionary tale. His name appeared in the papers often, but it was never for anything good. The headlines painted him as a failure, a cautionary example of how not to inherit an empire. He was no longer the golden boy, no longer the future of more holdings. Instead, he was the son who had squandered everything. And Vanessa? Her social media posts were a tragic echo of her former self. The pictures that had once been filled with lavish vacations and designer items were now punctuated by hashtags of betrayal and regret. The woman who had once held the city in her grasp was now reduced to a broken narrative of victimhood, her posts now met with pity rather than envy. In the end, the legacy of Moore Holdings had shifted dramatically. It was no longer a story of family ties and inheritance. It was a story of survival, and Diana was the only one who had truly come out on top. Her empire was solid, her name was untouchable, and the future lay wide open before her. But one message, one simple text, continued to linger in the back of her mind. It buzzed on her phone again, this time from a number she hadn't seen in days. "I'm coming to see you." Ethan was still trying to claw his way back. Diana's penthouse, perched high above the city, had always been her sanctuary, a place where she could look out over the skyline and watch the world below shift and move. Tonight, the city shimmered in the darkness, 1,000 lights twinkling like distant stars, a reminder of everything she had built. And yet, for all the quiet grandeur, the room felt still, as though time itself had paused, waiting. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. She glanced at the screen. It was a message from Ethan. "I need to see you, please." She had known this moment was coming, the inevitable reckoning for a son who had been coddled, manipulated, and broken under the weight of his own arrogance. It was the culmination of everything, his fall from grace, his desperation, and now the final plea for forgiveness. Without a word, Diana stood from the desk where she had been reviewing documents, her fingers lightly brushing the smooth edges of the papers. Her gaze moved to the window, to the sprawling city beyond. She had conquered this place, built it, and in a way, she had built her family's downfall as well, with nothing but the strength of her own quiet resolve. The doorbell rang, its chime echoing in the vast silence of the penthouse. Diana didn't flinch. She had expected him. She had known he would come, just as he always had when his world crumbled around him. She moved slowly, deliberately, to the door. The man who stood there was a shadow of the son she had raised, disheveled, his eyes sunken, a far cry from the confident young man who had once claimed the world as his. Ethan stood on the other side, his hand trembling as he reached for the door handle. His suit, once tailored and immaculate, was now wrinkled, his tie undone, his face showing signs of sleepless nights and days spent in panic. "Mom," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "please." Diana's gaze remained steady, unwavering. She had seen him like this before, broken, pleading, and yet there was no sympathy in her eyes. Not this time. He opened his mouth to speak again, but Diana held up her hand. She didn't need to hear it. She had listened for years, listened to his demands, to his excuses, to the promises of change. But this time, she wasn't the mother who would bend, who would cave to his guilt trips and pleas for second chances. This time, she was the matriarch who had made a choice, and she wasn't going to turn back. Without a word, Diana stepped aside, allowing him entry, but her posture was firm, resolute. Ethan stepped inside, his eyes scanning the vastness of the penthouse, but the weight of the room didn't seem to register. It was as though he couldn't see it, couldn't see how far she had risen, and how far he had fallen. He didn't speak at first, as though the words had caught in his throat, suffocated by the realization of what had happened, of what he had lost. But then, with a shaky breath, he finally spoke, the words spilling out in a desperate rush. "I don't know what to do anymore, Mom. Everything's gone. I've lost it all. Vanessa, the business, everything. I'm drowning." Diana listened in silence, her arms folded, her expression unreadable. She had already heard it all. She had already made her decision. "You wanted me gone," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. I gave you exactly what you asked for. She paused, letting the words sink in. And now you come here, asking for what? Forgiveness? Ethan flinched, but Diana didn't give him the satisfaction of further pleading. She stepped back toward the window, her gaze once again drawn to the city. You made your choice, Ethan, she continued, her tone colder now. And I made mine. The silence between them stretched, heavy and uncomfortable, as Ethan stood there, unable to find the words that might undo the damage. Diana's eyes never left the view outside. She felt the weight of every decision she had made over the years, but none of them weighed heavier than this one. Turning her back on her son had been the hardest thing she had ever done, and yet, as she stood there, watching the city she had built unfold before her, she knew she had made the right choice. Finally, she turned back to him. You can't come back from this, she said, her voice calm but firm. I'm done. Ethan's face twisted with the weight of her words. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came. He had lost her. And in a way, he had lost himself too. Diana moved to the side, her gaze still fixed on the skyline. She didn't need to look at him anymore. The past was gone. The future was hers. A soft pop echoed through the room as Martha appeared with 2 glasses of wine, the deep amber liquid catching the light. She poured with a grin, her eyes meeting Diana's with a knowing look. To your strength, Martha said, raising her glass, and to what's to come. Diana took the glass, her fingers brushing against the cool surface of the crystal. She clinked her glass gently against Martha's, the sound a quiet promise. To the future, she said, her voice calm and resolute. In the corner of the room, Harold quietly entered, holding something in his hands, a framed plaque, the words carefully engraved. For your legacy, he said, offering it to her. Diana took the plaque, her gaze falling on the engraved words. More holdings, a legacy of strength. Her eyes softened for a moment as she held it, the weight of everything finally feeling right. She gazed out at the lake, serene in her victory. And as the final lines of her story were written, she spoke softly, the words a quiet declaration. He asked me to disappear. Instead, I carved my name in stone.